Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our continuing examination of the topic of There's Something About Mary. We're going to be continuing on addressing some legalistic issues related to the relationship between Joseph and the entity known as Jesus and the entity known as Mary. So, we're going to be addressing what is known as the putative father dynamic and what exactly that entails. We're going to see examples of the putative father in scripture, and we're going to deconstruct that in this exegesis. Now, some individuals are insisting when they cherry pick certain things that there are things that are in scripture that are indicating to them that Jesus is the biological, naturally conceived child of Joseph. However, there is no consistent indication of that. In fact, everything in scripture points to something that is the opposite of that. And we're going to look at some of that language. And so, what people are having an issue with is this idea of the immaculate or the asexual conception. And we're going to talk about why this problem comes about for some individuals. Even though the scripture narrative related to the Immaculate Conception is generally clear, there are a number of individuals who identify as Messianic Hebrew and some who identify as Christian who have turned this entire narrative into one big gender war that is undergirded by a significant amount of misogyny. And so, for some individuals, this Immaculate Conception narrative serves as a trigger. And so there's a belief that this is some sort of conspiracy, this narrative that is rooted in this idea of not needing a man. And so there is some upset with the scripture narrative wherein individuals are saying that the conspiracy is to suggest that a man is not needed or was not needed to bring forth the Messiah. And so some individuals are upset about a woman being chosen by the Creator to bring forth the Messiah versus a man and a woman. And so that's what's at the heart of a number of these narratives suggesting that the scripture is wrong and that everything in the scripture related to the Immaculate Conception is wrong and is a corruption of the scripture. And so, again, individuals are cherry picking and finding all sorts of ways to insert Joseph into the narrative as the natural, biological father of the entity known as Jesus. And this includes talking about things like the Messiah coming from the seed of David. And we can get into that in more depth, but we're just going to be addressing the issue of the putative father in this particular discussion. Now, what is the Immaculate Conception about? Immaculate means something that is clean or a pure conception. And of course, immaculate is synonymous with chaste, virgin, pure, modesty. And so, along with this Immaculate Conception dynamic, there is also this legalistic dynamic of the putative father. And so, Joseph is understood and presented as the putative father. And you can see this in the language that is surrounding the relationship between the entity known as Jesus and the entity known as Joseph. And so, Joseph is presented as this putative father. That means the commonly accepted father, the supposed father, not the father in fact, however. He is the assumed father. And you see this type of situation when a woman and a man happen to be married and a baby is born during the marriage. The man, the husband, is assumed to be the father of the child. However, it is possible for that assumption to not be accurate, but he is still going to be treated legally as the child's father during that marriage because he's the assumed father, even though he might not biologically be the child's father. And of course, you can have tests done to address this putative father status. And here you can see the language that indicates this putative father relationship between Joseph and Jesus. And so at Luke 3, this is NIV 23. Now Jesus himself was about 30 years old when he began his ministry. He was the son, so it was thought, of Joseph. And so you can see Luke clarifying the nature of the father son relationship between Jesus and Joseph. And he indicates he was the son, so it was thought of Joseph. And here we see in the KJV similar language. This is Luke 3:23. And Jesus himself began to be about 30 years of age, being, as was supposed, the son of Joseph, which was the son of Heli or Eli. And so here, what you see is this pointing out that this was a supposed father-son relationship. But in reality, biologically, this is not the father. And so there's this genealogy that is following, but this is the genealogy for Joseph. Now, some individuals indicate that this is the genealogy of Mary, but there's nothing in here to indicate that this is the genealogy of Mary. So it's unclear where people are getting this from. And so they say that an earlier genealogy is actually the genealogy for Joseph, and that this one is the genealogy for Mary, and that the original one, that earlier one, is the genealogy that places Joseph in the line of kings. And so therefore, Jesus would have to come through this particular line, and he has to be the natural biological child of Joseph in order for this entire narrative to hang together for them. Now, what's interesting about this is that individuals are completely dismissing the possibility that the person who is coming through this royal lineage, it just may be Mary. It might just be that simple. And so the person who's coming from the seed of David, and many individuals like to point that out, that individual might very well be Mary, and this might be a matrilineal dynamic. And here we've pulled out the language from the NIV and the KJV so that you can see very clearly that they are suggesting the same thing. And so in one indication, it is Jesus was the son of Joseph, so it was thought. Jesus is the son of Joseph, as was supposed. And so it's indicating here that he was thought to be the son of Joseph. He was supposed to be the son of Joseph. But this language indicates that he was not, in fact, biologically and naturally the son of Joseph. And using David's seed is not going to change this entire narrative. And so we're going to do a KJV breakdown here for this exegesis. And we see here, when you look down in the middle there, for was supposed. In the Greek, it goes to 35:43, and we're just going to look at what that's all about. And it's interesting to note that when you go from the Greek into the English, it looks just like the NIV. So the NIV and the KJV are essentially saying the same thing. It was thought, it was supposed. And so this is the supposed child of Joseph. And so, what is meant by this idea of supposed? When you look in the dictionary and you see the dictionary definition of supposed, it's pretty clear. And so, with respect to the relationship between Joseph and Jesus and that father child, father son relationship, what you have is a supposed relationship. And supposed means a pretended situation, an alleged situation, a believed father and son relationship, an imagined father and son relationship, an expected father and son relationship. But what you don't have is a father and son relationship in fact. And then we go right back to that putative dynamic, which is that alleged dynamic. So, with respect to Jesus being the biological son of Joseph, what you have is an alleged relationship. And so the alleged relationship is accused but not proven. It is asserted to be true or to exist, but it's questionable. And so we go right back to that supposed dynamic again. And so the scripture points out that it's supposed, but some individuals don't want to let go of this idea that this immaculate conception cannot possibly be true. And so therefore they skip right over the indication that it is a supposed relationship, that it is sort of a legal relationship. It's an adopted relationship. Now, of course, when individuals are legally adopted, they do take on the genealogy of the adopted parent. And so it may be difficult to disentangle all of that. But with respect to this narrative, what is being pointed out here is that Joseph is not considered the natural biological father of Jesus, even though he is the earthly father of Jesus. So he is serving as the father here on earth. And then going back to Strong's, you see at this 3543 number that this idea of the supposed son or the supposed father means the father in practice, the considered father. This is the person who is deemed to be the father or thought to be the father by custom, the supposed father yet again. And so it's pointed out that this is something that might be by law or by custom. And so you see again that it's continuing on with this idea of supposed or thought to be. And here you see some additional indications related to this idea of the supposed or putative father, that this would be the father who would be held out as the father by custom or by usage. Again, this is the person who is thought to be the father. If they were engaged, then people would assume that this is the father. If they were married, then people would assume that this is the father. Of course, every adult knows that that might not actually be the case. And continuing on, you see that this idea of the supposed father son relationship is something that is deemed by law. And so it's not a biological, natural father son relationship that's being indicated. Now, in order to overcome the language related to Joseph being the supposed father of Jesus, some individuals will offer that there is a narrative about the Messiah coming through the seed of David. And so many individuals are insistent that this means that Jesus must be the natural biological son of Joseph, who is identified as coming through the seed of David. And they are very myopic in their understanding of seed. And so, even though seed is related to the word sperm, SPERM, seed is related to the idea of offspring. It is a person's issue. It's a person's descendants in terms of genealogy. So, this would be the children, the grandchildren, the great grandchildren. So, it would be all of those people in line. And so, it may very well be that part of the narrative that we don't have is that if it has to be biological and it has to be from the seed from David and it has to be natural, then Mary would be the natural offspring in this particular narrative because you do not have a biological relationship indicated in the narrative with respect to Jesus and Joseph. All you have is Mary. And so if you're going to do some sort of logical construction of this relationship from David to Jesus, the only person that you have biologically, according to the narrative, is Mary. But that's not being spoken. That shouldn't be a surprise to anyone because the identity of women in scripture has been minimized. And sometimes you don't even know who the women are. You just know that it was a female. You don't know the person's name. And so you don't have sufficient narratives related to the females to come to a complete understanding sometimes of the role of females in these narratives. But in terms of just a natural logical conclusion, the natural logical conclusion would be Mary, because it's certainly not Joseph. If you are doing a basic reading and deconstruction of the scripture, you can see that the language about the relationship between Joseph and Jesus, that language is clear on its face. This is not language that is primarily coming from Paul. And so it's very clear on its face, even if you're looking at the KJV. But what's happening is individuals who are identifying as Messianic Hebrews, for the most part, are engaging in significant histrionic dynamics. And so those histrionics take away from a basic understanding of the scripture because there is a lot of drama involved. So what do we mean by histrionics? This extreme theatrical presentation when discussing the scripture. And so individuals are using these histrionics in order to distract from the actual scripture. And so people are distracted, so they are not able to clearly follow what is going on. And this is a part of a manipulation because you can use theater to teach about scripture or about anything. But in this case, this theater serves as a paradigm for distraction from what might be the truth of the matter in scripture. And you see this with the raising of the voices and all of these gestures that are going on with individuals when they are using histrionics in order to distract from what the truth happens to be, or in order to manipulate people into believing something else. And sometimes people get overwhelmed by the histrionics because they can be just so extreme in presentation. As we wrap this up, what we have is Mary being the biological parent of the entity known as Jesus. We have Joseph being the putative father, or the legal father, or the stepfather, or the adoptive father of the entity known as Jesus. And if there is an insistence that Jesus is coming through the seed of David in the flesh, the only entity that we have according to the narrative. Now, people could step out and assume all sorts of things, but according to the narrative, the only biological relationship here is the one with Mary. And so, if people were going to sort of assume a relationship, then Mary would have to be the entity, according to the narrative, that is the seed of David. And so, this may be a matrilineal dynamic with respect to the seed of David coming through the mother known as Mary or Mariam.